To understand why a small Central American nation became the center of the financial universe for a few months in 2021, we have to look at what life was like before all this happened. El Salvador is the smallest country in Central America. It's a place of dense greenery, Pacific coastlines, and dramatic geology, often called the land of volcanoes. For a long time, the economy of this land was just as volatile as the ground beneath it. If you traveled there in the 90s, you would have paid for your coffee using the colon. It was the national currency named after Christopher Columbus. But the colon had a problem. It lost value often. Inflation was a constant worry for families trying to save for the future. So, in 2001, the government made a drastic decision. They decided to stop printing their own money entirely. They retired the colon and adopted the United States dollar as their legal tender. Overnight, the country gave up its monetary sovereignty. They could no longer print money to pay off debts or stimulate the economy. They were effectively tethered to the decisions made by the Federal Reserve in Washington, D.C., thousands of miles away. But for the average citizen, this brought a certain kind of stability. Prices stopped jumping around so much. A dollar was a dollar. However, dollarization didn't solve the deeper issues, it just changed the texture of them. The economy of El Salvador relies heavily on people who don't actually live there. Millions of Salvadorans live abroad, mostly in the United States. They work hard, often in difficult jobs, and they send a portion of their wages back home to support their mothers, fathers, and children. These payments are called remittances. In many wealthy nations, we don't think much about how money moves. We tap a card or send a bank transfer, and it is free or costs pennies. But in El Salvador, before 2021, the picture was very different. Remittances make up more than 20% of the country's entire GDP. That is a massive number. It means the economy is fueled by cash coming in from the outside. But getting that cash into the hands of a grandmother in a rural village was not easy. The banking system was essentially broken for the poor. Roughly 70% of the population did not have a bank account. They had no debit card, no banking app, and no credit history. They operated entirely in cash. This meant that if you were a construction worker in Los Angeles and wanted to send $200 home to your family, you couldn't just wire it. You had to use a service like Western Union or MoneyGram. You would physically go to an office, fill out forms, and hand over your cash. The service would take a cut, sometimes 10%, sometimes more. Then your family member in El Salvador would have to take a bus to the nearest city, stand in line, sometimes for hours in the hot sun, and show their ID to pick up the paper cash. It was slow. It was dangerous because everyone knew that people leaving those offices were carrying money. And it was expensive. It has been estimated that financial intermediaries were extracting hundreds of millions of dollars a year in fees from these transfers. That is money that was earned by hard labor, intended for food and medicine, but was instead lost to the friction of the legacy financial system. This was the status quo. It was a system where it was expensive to be poor. Because the majority of people were unbanked, they couldn't build credit. They couldn't easily get loans to start a business. They kept their savings under the mattress where it was vulnerable to theft. The country was stuck. It was using a strong currency, the US dollar, but it had no modern way to move it around. It was a cash-heavy society living in a digital world. The friction was everywhere, and usually when there is that much friction and that much dissatisfaction with the way things work, the door is left open for something radical to walk in. The soil was perfectly prepared for a new idea, but nobody expected that idea to come from a beach town, or that it would be championed by a president wearing a backward baseball cap. To find the spark that started this fire, we have to travel north. We must leave the tropical heat of Central America and go to the humid, neon-lit streets of Miami, Florida. The date was June 5th, 2021. The world was just beginning to wake up after the long, quiet year of the pandemic. In Miami, thousands of people had gathered for an enormous event called Bitcoin 2021. It was not a normal meeting for finance people. There were no gray suits, no boring boardrooms, and no quiet, polite clapping. This was a carnival. It was loud and chaotic. People wore costumes and baseball caps. The energy in the air was thick. Bitcoin was expensive at the time, and everyone there felt like they were winning. But despite the party atmosphere, The industry was still looking for respect. Most of the world still saw Bitcoin as a toy for computer geeks or a way to gamble. It wasn't seen as serious money. Then came the speech that changed everything. On the main stage, a young American entrepreneur named Jack Mallers walked out. He was dressed casually, wearing a hoodie and a cap. He didn't look like a banker. He looked like a skater. He was very emotional. His voice shook as he spoke. He talked about the problems we just discussed, how hard it was for poor people to send money across borders, and how the fees were eating away at their savings. And then he pointed to the giant screen behind him. A video began to play. It was a recorded message from the President of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele. The huge room went silent.
I think it's going to be the future. And it is the present already in a lot of things, but it's going to be big, way bigger in the future. And why? I mean, El Salvador has not been the country that's recognized to be the first in innovation, but why not this time? So being the first country adopting Bitcoin as a legal tender,
Then it exploded with noise. In the video, the president announced that he was sending a new law to his Congress. He was going to make Bitcoin legal tender in El Salvador. Legal tender. Those two words are very powerful. It meant that Bitcoin would not just be something you buy and sell like a stock or a house. It would be money. In the eyes of the law, it would be equal to the United States dollar. It meant that, in theory, you could pay your taxes in Bitcoin. You could buy groceries with it. You could pay for a bus ticket with it. It was a historic moment. A real country with a seat at the United Nations and its own flag had decided to embrace digital money. The crowd in Miami went wild. People were crying. It felt like a victory. While the champagne was flowing in Miami, the mood in El Salvador was very different. Imagine being a shop owner in the capital city, San Salvador. You are closing up your small store for the night. You count your paper dollars. You get ready for dinner. Then you see the news on your TV. Your president is telling a crowd of strangers in Miami that your money is about to change. There had been no vote. There was no long campaign to explain what Bitcoin was. Most people in the country had never even heard the word Bitcoin before. Confusion spread quickly. Did this mean the dollar was going away? Was the government going to take their pensions and turn them into digital coins? How could they use this new money if they didn't have a smartphone or the internet? The difference between the two places was sharp. In Florida, it was seen as a bold step toward freedom, a thunderclap that would wake up the world. But on the streets of El Salvador, it felt like a sudden, confusing experiment. The government moved incredibly fast. Within just a few days of the announcement, the Bitcoin law was passed. It was a very short document, only a few pages long. It said that every business must accept Bitcoin if a customer wanted to pay with it. The clock started ticking. The country had just 3 months to build the technology, teach the people, and prepare for a financial shift that usually takes decades. But what the world didn't know yet was that this idea hadn't come out of nowhere. While the president made the big announcement, the proof that it could actually work was already happening, quietly in a tiny village by the sea. To understand how the president got this idea, we have to look away from the capital city. We need to drive down to the coast, about an hour away, to a dusty, quiet village called El Zonte. El Zonte is not a financial hub. It is a surfing town. The roads are made of dirt. The vibe is slow and relaxed. For years, backpackers and surfers have traveled there to ride the perfect waves that roll in from the Pacific Ocean. But in 2019, long before the president's announcement, something strange started happening in this village. It began with a mystery. A local community leader received a donation from an anonymous person in the United States. This donor had a lot of Bitcoin, and they wanted to do something good with it. But there was a catch. The donor did not want the money to be cashed out into dollars. They didn't want it to be spent once and then disappear. They wanted to see if a community could actually use Bitcoin as money in their daily lives. They called the project Bitcoin Beach. At first, it seemed impossible. Remember, this is a place where most people didn't have bank accounts. Many older people didn't even use smartphones. But the team behind Bitcoin Beach started small. They focused on the youth. They paid local teenagers in Bitcoin to clean up trash from the beaches and to study. These young people were quick to learn. They downloaded wallet apps on their phones and started sending value to each other instantly. Then it spread to the local businesses. The most famous example is the pupusa sellers. A pupusa is the national dish of El Salvador, a thick corn tortilla stuffed with cheese, beans, or meat. It is delicious and it costs less than $1. In El Zonte, elderly women who had used paper cash their whole lives began accepting digital payments. They would pull out a tablet or a phone, show a QR code, which looks like a square barcode, and the customer would scan it. Beep! The money moved instantly. No bank fees, no waiting. It created what economists call a circular economy. The surfer bought a coconut with Bitcoin. The coconut seller used that Bitcoin to pay for his lunch. The lunch lady used it to pay her electricity bill. For the first time, these people had a bank in their pocket. They could save money without worrying about it being stolen from under their mattress. It wasn't perfect. The technology was new and sometimes difficult. But it was working. While the rest of the world was arguing about whether Bitcoin was good or bad, the people of El Zonte were just using it to buy groceries. Word of this experiment began to spread. It didn't just stay in the surfing magazines. The news reached the presidential palace in San Salvador. President Bukele saw El Zonte as a beta test, a small trial run for the whole country. He saw that if a grandmother in a remote fishing village could learn to use this technology, then perhaps the whole nation could too. He saw a future where El Salvador wasn't just following the old rules of the global financial system, but writing new ones. So El Zonte became the blueprint. But scaling this up from a village of a few thousand people to a nation of 6 million people was going to be a massive challenge. The government needed a tool. They couldn't just rely on the apps that the surfers were using. They needed their own app, their own system to launch this nationwide experiment. And they gave it a very specific name, Chivo. The date was set for September 7th, 2021. This was Bitcoin Day. The government had spent months preparing. They built a digital application for smartphones called Chivo. In Salvadoran slang, the word Chivo means cool or good. It is a word you would hear young people say on the street. By naming the government's official bank wallet cool, they were trying to make finance feel friendly and modern. To get people to download it, the president made a very attractive offer. Every citizen who downloaded the app and scanned their ID would receive $30 worth of Bitcoin. $30 might not sound like a fortune to everyone, but in El Salvador, the minimum wage is quite low. For many families, $30 was enough to buy food for a week. It was a powerful incentive. The morning of the launch arrived. The sun rose over San Salvador. People woke up, grabbed their phones, and tried to find the Chivo app. But it wasn't there. The technology platforms, Apple and Google, hadn't listed the app yet. When it finally appeared, the servers, the computers running the system, could not handle the traffic. Millions of people were trying to sign up at the exact same moment. The system crashed. The president had to go on Twitter and tell people to stop trying for a while so they could fix the machines. It was a chaotic start. On the streets, things were even more intense. While some people were excited about their free $30, others were angry. Thousands of protesters marched through the capital city. They held signs that said, "No to Bitcoin." They were worried. They believed this new money would bring instability. They feared it was a way for the government to track them or gamble with their taxes. In one dramatic moment, a brand new Bitcoin ATM machine, one of the kiosks installed by the government, was set on fire. The image of the burning machine was broadcast on news channels around the world. To make matters worse, the price of Bitcoin itself decided to crash that very same day. On the morning of the launch, the value of Bitcoin dropped sharply. It lost about 10% of its value in just a few hours. The critics said, "I told you so." They pointed at the charts and said it was too dangerous for a country to use. But the president was undeterred. He went on social media and announced that the government was buying the dip. He was treating the national treasury like a trader's account, buying more Bitcoin while the price was low. Eventually, the technical glitches were fixed. The Chivo app started working. Millions of Salvadorans signed up. They got their $30. For a few weeks, the country was full of people staring at their phones, figuring out how to scan QR codes to buy coffee, gas, or groceries. It was a massive digital experiment. A whole population was learning a new language of money all at once. But as the dust settled, the government began to talk about something even bigger. They didn't just want a wallet app, they wanted to build an entire city dedicated to this new technology. And they planned to power it with the energy of the Earth itself. By November of 2021, the initial shock of the law had faded, and the government decided it was time to dream even bigger. The president invited Bitcoin enthusiasts from all over the world to another massive party. This time, it wasn't in Miami. It was right there in El Salvador on the beach. There was rock music, there were fireworks lighting up the night sky. And at the end of the event, the president walked onto the stage to reveal his most futuristic idea yet. He announced plans to build Bitcoin City. He wasn't talking about a few office buildings. He was describing a brand new metropolis to be built from scratch in the Gulf of Fonseca, near the bottom of a volcano called Conchagua. He described a city shaped like a perfect circle, like a coin. In the center, there would be a plaza with a giant Bitcoin symbol that could be seen from space. It sounded like something from a science fiction movie. There would be no income tax and no property tax. It was designed to be a haven for people who wanted to live and work in the crypto economy. But the most interesting part was how the city would be powered. Bitcoin is digital, but the computer network that runs it needs electricity. The computers that secure the network are constantly working, solving math problems, and they get hot. They need energy. El Salvador is the land of volcanoes. The president explained that they would harness the heat from the earth to power the city and to run the Bitcoin computers. It is a clean, natural process. The heat from deep underground turns water into steam. The steam spins a turbine, and the turbine makes electricity. The vision was poetic. A futuristic city built near a jungle powered by a volcano. To pay for all of this, the government announced something called the volcano bonds. Normally, when a country needs to borrow money to build roads or hospitals, it goes to big international banks or organizations like the International Monetary Fund. They sign complicated agreements with strict rules. El Salvador wanted to bypass that. The volcano bond was a way to borrow money directly from the people. They wanted to raise $1 billion from Bitcoin investors around the world. The plan was simple. Half of the money would be used to build the city and the energy plants. The other half would be used to buy more Bitcoin. If the price of Bitcoin went up, the country would share the profits with the people who bought the bonds. It was a bold experiment in sovereign debt, how a country manages its credit card. However, dreams are often easier to announce than to build. Months passed. The launch date for the bonds came and went. The construction of the city did not begin immediately. The reality of international finance and the falling price of Bitcoin in 2022 made the plan difficult to execute. Critics called it a fantasy. They said the city was just a pretty drawing to distract people from other problems. But for the believers, it remained a powerful symbol. It represented a small nation trying to use its natural resources, its volcanoes, to break free from the traditional way of doing things. While the government was dreaming of futuristic cities, the traditional financial world was watching with folded arms, and they were not happy. The big organizations that usually manage the world's money were preparing to give El Salvador a very stern warning. While El Salvador was celebrating its new independence, the giants of the global financial world were watching with deep concern. To understand this conflict, we have to look at the organizations that keep the world's economy stable. The biggest one is the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. You can think of the IMF as the world's financial safety net. When a country gets into trouble, when it runs out of money or cannot pay its debts, the IMF is usually the one who steps in to help. They lend money to keep the country running, but in exchange for that help, they usually demand strict rules. They want countries to be careful, safe, and predictable. Adopting Bitcoin was the opposite of safe and predictable. From the offices in Washington, D.C., the decision looked incredibly risky. The IMF issued stern warnings. They published reports saying that giving Bitcoin legal status could destabilize the country's economy. Their argument was simple. Bitcoin is volatile. Its price goes up and down violently, sometimes in a single day. Imagine if a country held all its savings in a stock that could lose half its value in a month. If the price of Bitcoin crashed, the government might not have enough money to pay for schools, hospitals, or police. The IMF felt this was a gamble a small country could not afford to take. The World Bank, another massive organization that helps developing nations, also refused to help El Salvador with the technical side of the Bitcoin rollout. They cited environmental concerns and transparency issues. Then came the credit rating agencies. These are companies that give every country a score, just like a personal credit score. If your score is high, it is cheap to borrow money. If your score is low, it becomes very expensive because lenders think you might not pay them back. After the Bitcoin law passed, agencies like Moody's lowered El Salvador's score. They essentially told the world, be careful. Lending money to this country is now much riskier. This had real consequences. It meant that if El Salvador needed to borrow money to build a bridge or a road, they would have to pay much higher interest rates. But President Bukele did not back down. In fact, he seemed to enjoy the fight. He took to Twitter, his favorite way to communicate, and posted memes mocking the critics. He framed the conflict as a battle for freedom. He argued that these international organizations wanted to keep small countries poor and dependent. He said that El Salvador was a sovereign nation. It had the right to choose its own money without asking for permission from bankers in other countries. It was a clash of two different worlds. On one side, the old established order of fiat currency and central banks, which values stability above all else. On the other side, a new digital movement that values independence and risk-taking. The financial world predicted doom. They thought the economy would collapse under the weight of this experiment. But interestingly, while the bankers were turning away, a different group of people started packing their bags. The warnings from the IMF had an unintended side effect. They acted as a massive advertisement. People who had never thought about visiting Central America were suddenly looking up flight tickets. The country was about to experience a very different kind of boom. While the bankers in Washington were writing angry reports, something unexpected was happening at the airport in San Salvador. For decades, the arrivals terminal had been a relatively quiet place. Most people landing there were Salvadorans returning home to visit family or aid workers or diplomats. It was not a major destination for leisure. The headlines about gang violence had kept most tourists away. But after the Bitcoin law, the demographic changed. Suddenly, you saw a new type of visitor. They were often young, usually male, and they came from the United States, Europe, or Asia. They wore t-shirts with crypto logos. They carried cameras. They were not there for the all-inclusive resorts. They were there on a pilgrimage. El Salvador had accidentally invented a new industry: Bitcoin tourism. People wanted to see it with their own eyes. They wanted to go to a Starbucks and pay for a latte with a Lightning Network transaction. They wanted to visit El Zonte and buy a pupusa from a street vendor using digital magic. It became a badge of honor in the crypto community to post a picture of yourself in El Salvador. It was proof that you were a true believer, that you had visited Mecca. The numbers confirm this shift. Tourism in the country surged. Some reports showed that tourism numbers jumped by more than 30% in the year following the adoption. But it wasn't just about the money they spent. It was about the story they told. For the first time in history, the international news about El Salvador wasn't about violence or poverty. It was about technology. It was about the future. This rebranding was arguably more valuable than the Bitcoin itself. The President, Nayib Bukele, understood this perfectly. He wasn't just a politician. He was a master of branding. He knew that by aligning his country with this loud, passionate global community, he gained a digital army of defenders. When the mainstream media wrote negative articles, thousands of Bitcoiners would flood the comments section to defend El Salvador. However, we must be honest about the full picture. The tourists didn't just come because of the digital currency. They also came because the country was becoming safer. At the same time as the Bitcoin rollout, the government was conducting a massive, controversial crackdown on the gangs that had plagued the nation for years. The streets were safer to walk at night, so you had a powerful combination: a country that was suddenly safe enough to visit, and a unique hook, the Bitcoin experiment, that gave people a reason to book the flight. The hotels in the capital were full. The surf instructors in El Zonte were booked solid. The country had successfully pivoted. It was no longer seen as a place to avoid. It was seen by a growing niche of people as the Singapore of Latin America. But as the initial excitement of the tourists faded and they flew back home, the locals were left with the reality of the situation. The party was fun, but did the experiment actually work for the people who lived there every day? So here we are, looking back at the experiment a few years later. The dust has settled, the news crews have gone home, and we are left with the big question: did it actually work? The answer is complicated. It depends entirely on what you think the goal was. If the goal was to get the average grandmother to stop using dollars and start using digital satoshis to buy her vegetables, then the experiment has largely struggled. Walk through the markets of San Salvador today, and you will see the Bitcoin accepted here stickers peeling off the windows. Most people have gone back to cash. The Chivo wallet, despite the big launch and the free money, is not the main way people pay for things. It turns out that old habits die hard. The United States dollar is still the king of daily commerce. It is familiar, it is physical, and it doesn't require a charged battery or a data signal. Even the remittances, the killer app that was supposed to save people millions in fees, didn't change overnight. The data shows that the vast majority of money sent home still comes through the traditional giants like Western Union. People trust what they know even if it costs them more. So, by those metrics, the critics were right. The revolution didn't happen at the checkout counter, but if you look at the experiment through a different lens, the picture changes completely. While the shopkeepers went back to cash, the country itself changed its destiny. Before 2021, El Salvador was known globally for two things: gangs and instability. It was a place people avoided. Today, it is discussed in boardrooms in New York, London, and Singapore. It rebranded an entire nation. The Bitcoin tourism we talked about earlier wasn't just a phase, it planted a flag. It attracted entrepreneurs, developers, and investors who would have never considered placing a pin on that part of the map before. And then there is the investment itself. For a long time, the government's decision to buy Bitcoin with public money looked like a disaster. When prices crashed in 2022, the mainstream media laughed. They tracked the losses every day. They called the president a fool for gambling with the treasury. But the government didn't sell. They held on. They kept buying 1 Bitcoin a day. And as the market turned and the prices climbed back up to record highs in the years that followed, that foolish gamble turned into a massive surplus. The country's balance sheet is now in the green. The bet paid off. They have used some of that profit to fund veterinary hospitals and schools. They prove that a small country doesn't always have to bow down to the big international banks. They can take their own risks and reap their own rewards. So, was it necessary? Maybe the point wasn't just about a faster way to buy coffee. Maybe it was about a small nation standing up and shouting, "We are still here, and we are not afraid to try something different." El Salvador tried to opt out of the standard financial system. They haven't completely succeeded, they still use the dollar, and they still have debt. But they opened a door that can never be closed. They showed the world what happens when a country treats magic internet money as real value. If you learned something new from this story and appreciate this kind of content, please consider subscribing. It really helps me continue making these videos for you. Thank you for watching.